I like Hester.
Yeah, she's great.
She's been on the right side of history.
Yeah, and you know what's great about her is that she doesn't just vote the right way on the stuff. She actually will write these letters and speeches and communiques and press releases where she communicates why the SEC is wrong, and that's super helpful because she articulates the pro-freedom case and also lets everybody else know that, hey, there's this alternative way the SEC should be doing things, and super helpful.
I like her dissents.
Yeah, exactly. It's like being a Supreme Court dissenter. She writes these dissents, and they're important. Dissents can be very important in courts too.
Yeah, I kind of wondered with her whether she would end up getting the role of head of the SEC.
I think she's certainly positioning herself for that,
Good.
And I would be at this point surprised if she weren't.
Well, is that politically led? If Trump wins the election, it would be a Republican head, and if it's
the way it works and is there are 5 commissioners, and traditionally it's 3-2. So whoever's president appoints 3 or gets to have 3, and then the other party gets 2, and so the tiebreaker goes to the president. And so when there's a Democratic president, it's 3-2 Democratic appointees, and when it's 3-2 Republican, it's 3-2 the other way. And so one of the Democratic commissioners would roll off and be replaced by a Republican commissioner, basically.
It feels like a big job because the SEC has obviously been under a lot of pressure this year. I think Gensler has put them under a lot of pressure, and they've obviously lost lawsuits, which I think is incredible. Watching private companies sue the SEC and winning, I think is incredible.
It's that's been one of the most important developments of the last 12 months, I would argue. I mean, so if you think about when I first became public about my involvement in Bitcoin, when I wrote that big piece for National Affairs that brought us together for our first interview, Bitcoin and the U.S. Fiscal Reckoning, a big part of my goal with that piece was, first of all, to explain to Washington why Bitcoin was not a passing fad, why it was going to become increasingly important as the debt got larger and larger, but also to explain to Bitcoiners that, hey, you may think of yourselves as anarcho-capitalists and the Bitcoin network is uncensorable and all this great stuff, but Washington can still make your life hard. If our goal is for everybody to be able to use Bitcoin, the government can do a lot to make it hard for everybody to use Bitcoin. And so we have to think about all the ways in which that can happen, and how do we forestall it, or how do we prevent that from happening? And so from my point of view, some of the things that I was really concerned about then, and basically in terms of how I've looked at the public policy space related to Bitcoin over the last several years, it's been, one, let's make sure that we do everything possible to get at least one of the 2 major political parties to make it a litmus test that CBDCs should never exist in the United States. That's very, very important because, and that was 3 years ago, 4 years ago, that wasn't on the radar of every Bitcoiner. But the reason why it was important is that if you replace physical cash with a CBDC, then you can effectively prevent everyone in that currency from using Bitcoin because they can control the relationship between the CBDC and Bitcoin, the fiat rails, the on-ramps to buy Bitcoin. So that was number one existential threat in my view in terms of wide adoption of Bitcoin. Number 2, it was, could we get the ETF approved? And I know there's some people on the pure side who say the ETF is, it's not real Bitcoin, it's not self-custody. I get all that, believe me. But for that granny who is scared of losing her keys and who doesn't want to figure out how to do self-custody, it's a gateway drug. The ability to participate in the appreciation that comes from Bitcoin it's massive. It's massive for conventional investors who don't want to deal with the unusual accounting treatment. So getting the ETF approved was a huge milestone, and we can get into some of the intricacies of that are very interesting. And then the third goal that I had in 2021 was, could we get one of the 2 major party political nominees for president to explicitly endorse self-custody and explicitly oppose and ideally sign into legislation a ban of central bank digital currencies? And if we could accomplish those 3 things, then we would really be on the path to victory. And the reason why is that if you accomplish those 3 things, then Bitcoin has the runway to get so entrenched that it becomes impossible to completely reverse. So take the ETF as an example. If you if a lot of people in their 401ks and their retirement plans, in their ordinary investments, start owning Bitcoin or a Bitcoin associated asset like the ETF, and then Elizabeth Warren comes along and tries to get rid of it, there is an enormous wall of resistance because she's going to be hurting a lot of those ordinary people who are invested in Bitcoin, whether directly or indirectly. We've already seen how a lot of the Bitcoin-oriented businesses that lobby the government have been able to convince a lot of politicians that, hey, this is not something to get rid of. It's not just so, there was a risk, we talked about it in our last interview together, that being pro-Bitcoin was going to sort as a Republican thing and being anti-Bitcoin was going to sort as a Democrat thing, especially because of Elizabeth Warren really trying to make that the case. And what's been interesting just in the last
split.
But there was a real risk of that, and I think we were headed that way. And what's been really interesting just in the last couple of months, as of the time we're recording this podcast, that we're starting to see that not be the case, that a lot of center-left Democrats, particularly those in the New York City area, for whom the financial community is really important, they're saying, hey, hold on a minute. Chuck Schumer, who's the senator for New York State, Cory Booker, who's a senator for New Jersey, and the congressman in that region, they're saying, wait a minute, we're not on board with just wiping this whole industry out. This industry is important to our constituencies. There's a lot of people employing people in our states for whom this matters. And once you get the political economy of Bitcoin to the point that you have that happening, and then support for Bitcoin becomes bipartisan and not merely partisan, then we really have a chance to build that future of money that we all want to do.
That was quite incredible this week, though, right? I mean, look, you'll understand the details of the politics far better than I will. All I know is in the UK, people very rarely vote outside of party lines. You vote with the party, you vote with the whip, you go where you vote where you're told to go, or you face severe consequences. But SAB 121, was it 71 Dems?
I don't remember the exact number, but yeah, it was striking. And there were so many examples just in the last couple of weeks or months of things that have just been very surprising in terms of the Democratic Congress and the Democratic president, or the Democratic members of Congress, doing things that we wouldn't have expected them to do, say, a year ago. Some of them were these legislative efforts that you described. Then there was the approval of the ETH ETF, which, as Bitcoiners, we don't necessarily care about an ETH ETF, but as a signal of where the SEC is, there's a big difference between approving the ETH ETF and the Bitcoin ETF, because as you mentioned, with the Bitcoin ETF, they basically had no choice. There was the federal appeals court for the DC Circuit, which is the second highest court in the land, just only junior to the Supreme Court, basically told the SEC, you've been acting in an arbitrary and capricious way. You've discriminated against the Bitcoin ETF. There's no reason to do that when you've approved all these other ETFs that are very similar to the Bitcoin ETF. And basically, Gensler said, you know what? We're going to keep losing before the courts if we keep fighting this, and I only have so much resources and staff time. We got to dedicate it to battles we can win. We're not going to win this battle. He didn't want to give up, but he felt like he had no choice.
But why do you think do you think this for him was political games? This is career decisions. Like, this is essentially him doing Elizabeth Warren's dirty work because he wants to become Treasury Secretary. Is it that? Because I could never understand why somebody who's clearly a Bitcoiner, people have watched his educational presentations. Did he teach a course?
At MIT.
Yeah,
he taught a course on cryptocurrency at MIT. And there were a lot of people who thought he was going to be pro-Bitcoin because of that.
But what is the reason for him to have opposed these for so long? Is it just political games?
I don't think it's just political games. I think the view of the Elizabeth Warren wing of the world is that, and Gensler expresses, he put out a press release after he approved the Bitcoin ETF, where he basically, it was like a hostage video. It's like he said all this stuff about how, this should not be taken as an endorsement. We think that Bitcoin is basically primarily for criminal activity and terrorism and ransomware and tax evasion, and it's a highly speculative asset that no one should invest in if they care about their safety, their nest egg. So he said all this stuff as a way of, and the other Democratic appointees to the commission were much more vigorous in their criticism. But what was clear, the really the really telling parts of that press release were the ones where he said, look, the courts told us we were being discriminatory and we have to defer to the courts. So I think it was not so much political games as I think he and the Elizabeth Warren, philosophy is that Bitcoin is bad mainly because we can't control it the way we can control other things. And in order to bring it under control, we cannot let it get entrenched by allowing an ETF to occur. But what's interesting about the ETH piece is that there was no similar court case. So that's the one that really is kind of the more political signal, right? With the Bitcoin one, you could say, well, the political thrust of the Elizabeth Warren wing of the Democratic Party was still, hey, we're going to fight all this stuff. We're going to win some battles. We're going to lose some battles. We lost that battle because the courts went against us. But with the ETH one, there was no court decision, at least that had already occurred. Maybe they were anticipating one in the future. But this is where the speculation has arisen that, okay, maybe word is coming down from Biden that, hey, there's this Democratic pro-Bitcoin / crypto constituency out there that we're throwing away in a very close election, and let's push pause on that. We don't know if that's true. There's no firsthand reporting that's indicating that that's true, but it is very striking that that's happened. And it could also be, and at the same time, we saw Chuck Schumer and Cory Booker and some of these prominent Democrats in Congress basically kind of saying the same thing, like, hey, Elizabeth Warren, you don't get to tell us what to do. We have a different point of view here. And that battle had not spilled it into public view. That had been a behind-the-scenes thing where Elizabeth Warren had been very public about, hey, I'm raising the anti-crypto army, please join me. And the Democrats who didn't feel the same way were a little bit more muted. Now it's more, there's more of an open public division on the issue. And that's really important because so long as that's true, then Bitcoin itself, the asset, and also all the people trying to build Bitcoin-related businesses are going to have the room to continue to grow.
Well, it puts them in a tricky position because I'm not going to take credit for this. Somebody said this to me recently, but they said, you're not going to win votes by being anti-crypto, but you will lose votes by being anti. And so there's no benefit to them having this anti-crypto army unless it is some kind of backdoor lobbying from the Jamie Dimons to say, get rid of this, we don't want this. But there's no benefit to them to do this. And now we've got Donald Trump coming out explicitly saying what you said in your third point in one sentence, which was to be pro-Bitcoin and crypto, to defend the right to self-custody, and saying a CBDC will never happen under him. I mean, he hit all your points in, 30 seconds?
It was a very important moment, I would say. And, there's some of the people in their reactions to those comments from Trump were, well, he believed very differently in 2019, so how can you trust him? He always changes his mind. I think that's something to keep an eye on. But
hold on, but we all do that with Bitcoin. We never hit it first time. I mean, Michael Saylor, we can go back and find tweets of his where he was very critical of Bitcoin and dismissed it, and so
what I'd say is that what we know about Donald Trump is that he is and there's a good side to this. He can be a very transactional guy. He's not an ideological guy. He is not orange pilled in the way that, say, Michael Saylor is orange pilled, right? He's not a guy who's going to, read Murray Rothbard or Mises or Hayek and start talking about Austrian economics. But he is a guy who understands politics, and he understands, hey, there's this big constituency out here that is unspoken for in terms of who they're going to side with, me or Biden. And if I make this full-throated case for the things that the people in the Bitcoin community have told me they care about, which are the things that we've described, and maybe throw in the Ross Ulbricht commutation on top of that.
Get the libertarians.
Yeah, and by the way, other parts of that speech that we're talking about, for the listeners who aren't following, as we're recording this, Donald Trump gave a speech at the Libertarian Party of the United States, where he was basically pitching for their votes. And libertarians are roughly 3 to 5% of the U.S. electorate. So an important swing constituency that can go either way, because plenty of people in the libertarian world, they tend to vote Democrat because of social issues like abortion or drug use and things like that. And some are more economically oriented. They vote Republican because they believe in free markets. And along with talking about Bitcoin, he talked about a lot of other things. He said, hey, you guys can kind of go along on your own and get your 3% of the vote, or you can vote for me and I'll appoint libertarians to my administration. I'll give libertarians a seat at the table. So he was clearly making a transactional argument that, hey, vote for me and you will get something out of it. It's kind of like coalition government in the European context. So there's a precedent for this in terms of Trump's history, which is that the last time he ran, the first time he ran, I should say, in 2016, a lot of the social conservatives who had a lot of reason to be skeptical of Trump. Here's a guy who's been married 3 times, has dated porn stars, not exactly the kind of guy who, if you're a member of the religious right, you're going to be super excited about. And Trump basically said, look, here's what I'm going to do to make a pitch to the religious right. I know that you guys care about Roe v. Wade and Supreme Court appointments and judicial appointments. So I'm going to outsource to the Federalist Society, which is the premier conservative judicial philosophy organization. I'm going to outsource to them my judicial appointments. And we're going to come up with a list of all the people who are going to be the short list of my Supreme Court nominees. No presidential candidate had ever done that before. This is the first time this had ever happened. And it was a brilliant political strategy, because then a lot of these people who were uncomfortable with Trump because of his life history were saying, hey, these judges are all people that I support, I believe in, they're part of our movement. And if he truly picks from that list, then we're going to win. And that's exactly what happened. He picked people from that list. Roe v. Wade got overturned, and that was a major victory for a movement that had, up to that point, had failed to achieve their goals. So I think there's a lot of reason to believe that this is in similar vein to that.
Did you see the Monk debate? I don't know when it was, with Steve Bannon and I think it's David Froome?
I did not.
So it's a debate on populism. Which I don't really need to get into myself, but what Steve Bannon was very good at saying is that this isn't about populism, because there's populist left, populist right. He said this is about what the elites have done and screwed up for everyone else. And here's Donald Trump, whatever you think of him, coming in and saying, no more of this bullshit. And he put a real staunch defense in of Donald Trump to someone like myself who struggles with him, but I think my struggle is a bit like my dad's was. It's a personality thing. It's not a policy thing. And so, like, I think that's a lot of people's biggest hurdle, certainly in Europe with Donald Trump. It's all personality. It's a personality thing, like what he's done. Has he got a shady past? Has he done some shady business stuff? But on policy things, he's always seemed to have like some good ideas, or spotted some. Maybe he spotted the energy crisis in Germany, right? He wanted to do the prison reforms. He has seemed to have good policy behind him.
He's certainly. I think he's oversimplified in the media. He's caricatured in the media a lot, particularly when it comes to his policy record. It's not straight down the line ideological. There are things he's done that, if you were a Democrat and you just took Trump, you crossed out the name and put generic Democrat on the resume of it, you'd say, hey, that's a good policy. For example, he's a guy who's been very adamant that prescription drug prices in the U.S. are too high, and let's do something about that. That's traditionally a Democratic issue, not a Republican one. To give one example, criminal justice reform. That's one that's bipartisan. At Free Op, we do a lot of work on that one as well. And so there's areas where he has been very interestingly non-ideological or counter-ideological. And there are other issues where he was more of a generic Republican, like on judicial appointments, like on tax reform, where his policies could have been implemented arguably by, there would be Paul Ryan or Mitt Romney or any of these other Republicans would have had the same views about those policies that he had, but he got them over the finish line. So I think that if one looks at the policies, it's definitely more interesting. But people have lots of opinions about Donald Trump, and he certainly does his best to help you generate whatever opinions you want about him.
Do you think this, with his policy, do you think that it comes down to him actually being quite independent of thought? yes, he's careful in playing the politics because he wants votes. But do you think he is quite independent in his thought, and therefore, if it's an economic policy, he probably comes from his business background. What's good for me and what's good for business people is probably good. Thinks it's probably good for everybody else. But also he has, that kind of. And some people struggle with this, but that kind of ethical backbone where it's like, well, it's ridiculous that drug prices are that high. It's ridiculous that the Guards Union can lobby for more people to be in cages. So do you think he's quite independent in his thought?
I think you could definitely say that he's independent in his thought in the sense that he doesn't defer to what the sort of gatekeepers ideologically in either party say he should believe. And in that way, he said, look, there was a time I remember in the first Republican presidential debate in 2015, so that election cycle, there were probably 10 people on the stage, and he got up and said, look, I have a property in Scotland, and I like the Scottish healthcare system. And everyone else on the Republican side said, hey, that's a socialist healthcare system. What are you talking about? And criticized him for it. And he's like, well, I just think it went really well. And look, I don't think the Scottish system is that great, so I don't agree with him on that. But the other candidates thought they would get a lot of mileage out of attacking him for that because of all the fights over Obamacare and the other things and over the past 15 years. And he didn't pay a political price at all for that. And I think, just over and over again, he's shown, I think what it is that it's two things. One, and I don't remember if we've talked about this before, but one thing a lot of people don't know about Trump that is he's a lot more scientific than in the views he takes than people think.
Okay.
So he, prior to running in 16, he almost ran in 12 and chose not to. But he spent the next 4 years having a small group of his lieutenants listening to all the major talk radio broadcasts every day and sending him like a one-page memo of, hey, what were the hot things on talk radio today? And over again, it was immigration. And even though he himself was a pretty non-ideological guy in immigration, he realized that immigration was something that a lot of conservatives who listen to talk radio all day were really mad about, illegal immigration in particular. And so he took that on as an issue.
The wall.
Yeah, so what I would say is that yes, he's an independent thinker, but a big part of it is he actually looks at where the voters actually are, as opposed to the kind of checklist of things that conservative intellectuals would say that he ought to support, and his deviations from conservative political orthodoxy are often ones where he feels, whether it's in a Republican primary context or general election context, the voters are more aligned with where he is. Or there's something like this Bitcoin thing that we're talking about where maybe not everybody cares about Bitcoin, but those who do are going to vote that way much more than the people who are skeptical about Bitcoin are going to care. And I think that's true in general in politics, democratic politics around the world, is that why does the government keep getting bigger all the time? It's because often there's some special interest carve out that particular special interest really cares about, and they're going to fight to the death to keep it. And even if everybody else is affected by it adversely, maybe the effect on you is really, really tiny if you're not involved. But that special interest, all their money is coming from that carve out. And so they fight to the death for it, right? That's the nature of democratic politics to a large degree. It's one of the flaws of democratic politics, arguably. But in this case, it works for Bitcoin, which is to say, if you can enlarge the constituency of people who really, really care about Bitcoin, have a real stake in it, and are willing to fight really hard and will vote on that basis, then politicians are going to realize that alienating or antagonizing that constituency has a greater cost than going along with what they have to say. And that's the value of what we're building now. And the thing that back in 2021, I was hoping we would get to a point where, and we're getting there, where the cost of being anti-Bitcoin is much greater than the benefit, or the benefit of being pro-Bitcoin for you politically is much greater than the benefit from being against Bitcoin.
And we're kind of there, and it's wild when you think about it. But you try and track the trajectory of Bitcoin. That originally when it was released, there's a few people on a forum sending it around itself. It has no value, and then eventually, it appears on some like early exchanges, and then we've gone through, these 4 or 5 cycles where it's just got bigger and stronger. You've got a whole new mining industry that's integrated with grids. It's become an election issue for presidents. I mean, it's wild that what started as an idea and a bit of code has become all this.
Yeah, and it's we're not completely there yet, but I think we're
close,
very well on our way. And the thing I'm starting to think about, so okay, if we do continue to succeed in this way, what's next? And there's a paper that I have you've interviewed before Natalie Smolensky of the Texas Bitcoin Foundation. I'm on the board of the Texas Bitcoin Foundation, and one of the projects we have there is called the Satoshi Papers. So we're publishing this thing later this year called the Satoshi Papers, which is meant to be a kind of a book that collects a lot of higher level thinking about the future of Bitcoin. Not merely kind of day-to-day commentary, but what should we really be thinking about for the next 10 years, 20 years about Bitcoin? And my essay that I've contributed to the book is about this question of, okay, we all believe, those of us who are in the Bitcoin community, we all believe that Bitcoin will win, right? That it's sound money, it's the soundest money that's ever been invented over time as the debt gets bigger and bigger in the US and in other countries, that Bitcoin will eventually become the premier store of value. I mean, of course, we already believe that it is, but that will be a consensus view of most people in financial markets and in the community. Now, the question is, how will governments react to that? Because if you ask Janet Yellen or Jay Powell or any of these major players in the government when it comes to financial policy, and you ask them what they think of Bitcoin, they're not worried today that Bitcoin is a threat to the US dollar. They'll laugh you out of the room if you say that to them. They think it's ridiculous, the idea that Bitcoin will ever compete with the US dollar. Their view, not that different from Elizabeth Warren's in a way, is that the primary use case of Bitcoin is as for ransomware, for tax evasion, for money laundering, things like that.
Whatever gets a news headline.
Right. So that's their honest view today. Now, and that's part of why we're actually able to do what we're able to do, in the sense that, like, if they actually thought, if the whole of government or the major players in the government actually thought that Bitcoin was a threat, a competitive threat to the US dollar today, we'd be seeing a much more aggressive regulatory push against Bitcoin. So we're actually kind of lucky that they don't feel that way, that it's a threat. But 10, 20 years from now, when the federal debt is at $150, $250 trillion, that's a different matter, because there's only about $450 trillion in the world. We literally will run out of other people's money. There won't be enough money left in the world to lend to the United States when our debt is that big.
But Bitcoin itself could be a $100 trillion market.
Absolutely. So at that point, then once it becomes very clear to the future Janet Yellens, the Jay Powells of the future, what that Bitcoin actually is a threat to the US dollar, what will happen? Will the U.S. government and other major governments around the world try to really fight Bitcoin? We talk about this adage. My working title for the piece is "Then they fight you." So we talk about this whole thing about first they ignore you, then they laugh at you, then they fight you, then you win. And we're kind of still in then they're laughing at you stage right now. But eventually we're going to get to then they fight you stage. And when they really fight you, what happens? What happens if the government tries to say, do what Roosevelt did in 1934 and ban self-custody, or force everyone to convert their self-custody into ETFs, or something else? Maybe it's just capital controls. They just ban the conversion of US dollars to Bitcoin, or fix it at a certain exchange rate.
But my question I've always had on that, at the time that Roosevelt did that, or when was the 6102?
Yeah, I want to say it was 1934.
Yeah. How many politicians actually held gold themselves to a significant amount?
Politicians, I don't know. Yeah.
Yeah, because but by the time that happens here, almost every politician will have a Bitcoin position, either directly or in their IRA or whatever portfolio they have, and so they might be damaging themselves. So it becomes this weird position whereby, again, the incentives might work for us.
Absolutely. So what I walk through in the piece are 3 scenarios.
Okay.
There's a negative scenario, a neutral scenario, and a positive scenario. I call the negative scenario the restrictive scenario, where there's capital controls, a lot of restrictions, kind of Argentina, pre-Malay Argentina style policies to kind of prevent you from converting your US dollars into Bitcoin as a way of trying to prevent Bitcoin from reaching escape velocity. The neutral scenario I call the palsied scenario. So imagine, the political dysfunction we have today, where Democrats and Republicans fight so much, you can't basically pass any major initiatives, just like why we can't reform the things that are causing the federal debt, the entitlements, things like that. Imagine that just continues, that polarization and dysfunction really prevent the U.S. from doing anything positively or negatively, meaning they can't restrict your use of Bitcoin, but nor can they fix the problems that are leading to the U.S. Federal debt crisis.
Right.
So that's sort of the neutral scenario, which is also a bad scenario for Americans, but not as bad as the first scenario where they're actually saying, hey, not only are we going to have a federal debt crisis, but we're going to prevent you from having the escape. We're going to try to prevent you from having the escape hatch so you can protect your own savings. In scenario 2, the neutral scenario, they don't prevent you from saving in Bitcoin. They just don't fix the problem, which will still have lots of problems for Americans and the world down the road. And then the third scenario, the positive scenario, I call the munificent scenario, where imagine a Milei-type character is elected in the presidential election of 2044 and is able to lead a reform of the U.S. system such that I think what we would have to do by then, because it'll be too late, if it's 2044 and we haven't fixed our problems in the U.S., we won't be able to fix them by simply reforming entitlements in the sense of the way we could today. There's not going to be the room anymore. So you'll have to do something like a structured bankruptcy, where you say, we'll do a partial default on Treasury securities in exchange for entitlement reform and backing the US dollar in the future with Bitcoin. So that would be the positive scenario, let's say, which would be to say, look, and we've seen examples of this in Latin America, in other countries, where basically they went bankrupt, they did a devaluation and a partial default, and then pledged to, say, tie their currency to the dollar or something like that, right? So imagine that in the U.S. context, it would be partial default, restructuring of these entitlements, and then backing the U.S. dollar with Bitcoin. And that would be the way to get the bond markets, the people who have to lend us money, to say, okay, that's the kind of scenario. Yes, I'll lose money on my existing Treasury bond holdings, but the end result will be in the future, the U.S. will be a stable country, so I'll buy that argument. And then Bitcoin really has won, right?
But the thing is I'm pretty sure you'll have the conviction that they need to be doing those kind of policies now.
That's so the think tank I run, that's what we work on every day at the Foundation for Research on Equal Opportunity. We're trying to get them to do that work today so that we avoid those more disastrous scenarios. And one thing I'll mention as a cautionary piece is that, today the distribution of Bitcoin is much more unequal than the distribution of fiat wealth, right? So unless people like you and I are successful, and all the people that you talk to on your show are more successful at getting more people to adopt Bitcoin, even the quote unquote winning scenario could be an unstable one, right? If most of the Bitcoin wealth is owned by a small group of OGs on a relative basis, and the ordinary people say, hey, screw this, I'm not for this kind of a system, right? That's not going to necessarily be, that might be a win for Bitcoin in the not short term, but mid to long term, but it will still be unstable in democratic economies.
Well, you could see anti-Bitcoin
Absolutely.
revolution. I mean, look, I saw a small version of it when I was in El Salvador making my film. There were many people who are against Bukele, mainly indigenous Salvadorans. And my Instagram, my social was getting attacked, lots of comments. There were protests, small protests, but they were like, no Bitcoin. Essentially say no to something that they don't realize could be good for them. But I was discussing this quite a bit with Danny, because I was thinking, look, if this continues to happen, there's going to be some significant wealth disparity. And when you have significant wealth disparity, you get revolutions.
Yeah.
You had it. Yeah, France had it. China had it. Russia had it. If you have, there could be the Bitcoin revolution, which is not a good one, which is a bloody one, which is there's so many people who are actually out of the Bitcoin system that they might have a revolution of their own.
Right. And I think I think one of my takeaways from this thought exercise of these three scenarios is that for us to succeed in the 20-year time horizon, not merely the 5-year time horizon, we've got to do as much as possible to make Bitcoin adoption as wide as possible, so more people have a stake in Bitcoin and really feel that it's benefiting them. And also, making sure that the broader, whether it's through layer twos or other enterprises, making sure that we are supporting the growth of the Bitcoin ecosystem. We can't, if Bitcoin is purely an asset that you hold and not something that you can borrow and lend in, and perhaps develop even securities in, and other tools, if we can't replace some of those TradFi tools with Bitcoin-based tools, then the role of Bitcoin in the world will be incomplete.
Maybe Trump can do his Trump checks for giving everyone a bit of Bitcoin. Lock it up. Lock it up.
Go ahead.
No, you go.
No, I was just going to say it really is interesting because in his last administration and he himself, he was a guy who was very skeptical of Bitcoin. He said, "Look, I believe in King Dollar. I don't want anything to threaten the dollar. And these Bitcoin people are telling me that Bitcoin's going to compete with the dollar. I don't like that because I like the dollar. I'm a patriotic American." And his administration had a lot of people who had that viewpoint in the Treasury Department and in other important financial policy roles. And so it is a major change that he's taken on this new position. And, there's a lot of people who were involved in making that happen.
Well, I think that's why Michael Saylor's been very clear on his position that Bitcoin isn't a threat to the dollar. And in some ways, Bitcoin can strengthen the dollar, right?
100%. I mean, that's the idea behind this positive or munificent scenario that I'll describe in this paper is if we, and the U.S. doesn't have to make those decisions 20 years from now. They could today. I mean, they are actually, the U.S. government is actually one of the largest holders of Bitcoin in the world. They auction some of it off, but they don't need to. They could just hold it in the treasury. And that will, if anything, like every time they seize some of the Bitcoin from these ransomware attacks or whatever, just park it in the treasury. Don't sell it and have it as a hedge. And de facto, the government's doing that, but the government doesn't have an explicit policy of doing that. And if it were to, I think that would be a very easy thing for Trump to do, just to say, hey, the Bitcoin we own, we're not going to sell it. We're just going to park it. And I think that could be a way for the U.S. government to start to build the reserve in Bitcoin that could then eventually become the basis for backing the U.S. dollar with Bitcoin.
Well, look, if they can print $6 trillion of debt, what's $6.5 trillion and buying $500 billion of Bitcoin? I mean, it's just, what's stopping them? There's nothing. It feels like a logical move.
Yeah. Well, that for the Federal Reserve to print money to then buy Bitcoin with it would be, that's not something this Federal Reserve is going to do. And I think it's going to be a while before the Federal Reserve gets there. But I will tell you, one of the projects we're working on at FreeOp is we're actually producing a documentary.
Oh, cool.
On trying to be a little bit like you. This one is basically, it's kind of a film version of that article, Bitcoin and the U.S. Fiscal Reckoning, where we talk about how the federal debt and the rising federal debt is the greatest social challenge of our time, particularly for young people. If you're Gen Z or millennial and you're entering the prime of your adult life, and in 20 years from now, there's going to be a massive fiscal crisis that's really going to affect you. It's going to result in massive persistent inflation and or higher interest rates that are going to make it hard for you to afford a home, afford healthcare, afford your daily, everyday cost of living. And that Bitcoin is one of the avenues to solve the problem for you as an individual. So that's something we're producing. We hope it'll be out at in late 2025. So we're in the process of so FreeOp is fronting the first 15% of the budget, and we're running around raising money to finish the production.
Can I tell you a really interesting story alongside that?
Please.
So my son went out to Kenya to work for Gridless for 3 months, and before he was going, he said to me, Dad, I'm thinking of selling my car. I'm not going to need it while I'm there, and I don't know how long I'll be and buying Bitcoin. I was like, oh yeah, that sounds sensible. So he sold his car, which probably didn't get as much as it was worth, bought Bitcoin, and Bitcoin is up, I want to say about 70% since then. So it was a really good move. But he's come back and he wanted to get a car again. And he was like, oh, I could sell that Bitcoin now and get a car. I was like, you could, or you can get on finance, and all you have to do is every month make your payments and either make it ideally from your job. Try and make it from your job.
Totally.
But if your job can't cover it because your payments are quite high, you sell a little bit of Bitcoin. And so I think he got it over 4 years, his car. And I said, I guarantee you, over 4 years, you're going to make more money by holding that Bitcoin and selling a little bit off to pay your car than just selling the Bitcoin now. So he's essentially done that. But his little Bitcoin nest egg is now something which can buy him a house. He before previously could not have bought a house if he wanted to because he couldn't get the deposit. I mean, he can come to me, of course, but like independently, he couldn't. But he's been stacking his Bitcoin. He got paid in Bitcoin in Kenya, and he now gets it. And now he's still growing his stack, but he's in a position now to buy a house because of Bitcoin.
Right. He has a stake in Bitcoin.
He has a stake
because he owns it.
Yeah, he had, and he's not going to sell his Bitcoin and buy a house because that's dumb. In the end, I'll lend him the money. But without me there, he would have been able to get in the position to buy a house. He could get a deposit. He could buy furniture and do those things, which it's like a 30 grand hurdle, really, where we live in somewhere like Bedford. Fuck knows what it's like here in Austin, but it was a 30 grand hurdle. Like he could do that now. He could essentially do that. It was purely Bitcoin. And so when we're trying, it's funny, you talk about, we're trying to get Bitcoin to as many people's hands as possible. A youngster, even my daughter's age, needs to start thinking about Bitcoin now,
right, for
her future.
Exactly.
As much as somebody who's heading towards retirement. Like we're all hit by the same issues of inflation.
Well, one of the quirks of U.S. tax law, which can always change because it's just tax law, is that when you die and you pass on your assets to your heirs, the cost basis of your assets resets to the point in which you die. So let's say you bought Bitcoin at $300 and now it's at $69,000. And you die today, and you pass your Bitcoin on to your successors. If they ever sell the Bitcoin, the cost basis at which they have to sell it is $69,000, not $300.
Had they had an inheritance haircut though at that point?
It depends on the size. So today, the estate tax only kicks in when the size of your inheritance. I believe it's over $11 million or something like that.
Really?
So
much lower in the UK.
For the and these are things that people argue about and want to change at various times. And these laws, these inheritance tax threshold for taxation, I believe, will expire in 2025. So one of the interesting things about this presidential election coming up is that the Tax Cut and Jobs Act, which is the big tax reform that Trump signed into law in 2017, many of the provisions of that tax law are expiring in 2025 and will need to be renewed by the president and Congress. So that's probably the number one fiscal policy issue that's going to come up in the next whoever's president in the next 4 years.
Well, he won't want a high.
He will want to extend all of those tax cuts, and Biden will want to get rid of most of them. So that's one of the big disagreements between them. But all this to say that so you were mentioning that one could make the argument that young people have the most stake in Bitcoin because they're the ones who are going to be around for the fiscal crisis of 2044. And for them, and that they have that runway of saying, hey, if I save Bitcoin for 20 years, it's going to appreciate. Actually, Kathy Wood in one of her ARK Invest slides has this great chart where she shows that basically if you've held Bitcoin for longer than 4 years, you've always made money 100% of the time. Now, past performance is not a an indicator of future results, but that just goes to show that if you're willing to withstand the short-term volatility, you generally do pretty well. And certainly over an even longer time frame, that's likely to be true. So you'd think you can make the argument that, well, young people in particular have a stake in Bitcoin's future success, but older people do too, because even if you yourself, it helps you retire comfortably, but even more importantly, you can pass these assets off to your heirs in a way that protect them because of this adjustment in the cost basis.
So how much of your time and the time of people who work at FreeOp is now focused on inflation? Is it just a constant thing you're having to consider or write about?
It's definitely a major one, and I would say it's not just inflation in the general sense. It's inflation in particular ways, like the inflation in the cost of higher education, inflation in the cost of energy, inflation in the cost of healthcare. So we look at a lot of different ways. It's funny, I know you recently interviewed Michael Saylor, and I remember one time I went to visit him, and he said to me, and I don't think he would mind me sharing this. He said, Avik, you do good work, but you don't spend enough of your time on Bitcoin. You need to spend more of your time on Bitcoin and not all this other stuff. And I tried to make the argument to him. I didn't persuade him, but I tried to make the argument to him that, look, I mean, the other stuff we do, it all relates to Bitcoin. Like, the fact that when I write a lengthy article about how CPI is a bureaucratic judgment and not an objective measure of prices, that I don't mention Bitcoin in that article, but somebody who reads that becomes hopefully more open-minded to why Bitcoin is useful, right? When we talk about how the Federal Reserve keeps interest rates at zero and therefore you can't afford a place to live, that article doesn't necessarily talk about Bitcoin, but it is of a piece for why Bitcoin is a better sort, should have a more important role in your savings. So having said all that, I agree with this critique on some level. I do want to do more writing about Bitcoin, more stuff on Bitcoin. That's why we're producing this documentary. And I'm doing some things to restructure my own role at FreeOp to hand off the day-to-day management to somebody else, to hire a new CEO, so I can actually, in a sense, kind of demote myself back to being a scholar and write more. And if I have the freedom to write more, then I can write more about Bitcoin. And but I think what I found is that the day-to-day commentary is something I could do more of, but the value of these longer think pieces is there too. Like this piece I'm about to publish on, as I mentioned, on the 20-year time horizon. Hopefully that is useful to people. And
every time you write a piece, I'm like, I need to talk to you. I want you to explain to me. By the way, Michael Saylor says that to everyone.
Well, Michael, if you're listening, I'm listening to you and I hear you and I'm working on it.
I think everyone he likes and thinks does good work. He says it to me all the time because he knows like I want to do other things. And I'm pretty sure he's like, you shouldn't bother with the bloody football team and get rid of your bar and just focus on your podcast. Like find the thing you're good at and focus on it. And like he's right. Like you should and could, but we all have different interests.
Congrats, by the way, on Rail Bedford. I mean, it's just been amazing. I'm so happy for you to see all the success you've had with that and what you've been able to do for your community. I know you're very passionate about your hometown and it's just awesome.
I'm trying to orange pill the town now. So,
how's that going?
Look, it's slow because people misunderstand Bitcoin, think it's a scam, probably think I'm a scammer. So I'm just doing a little bit at a time. Like the football club is a Bitcoin club, but it's not forced down your throat. You can come to a game, you can pay with your credit card or your cash, you can get a beer or burger, you can forget about the Bitcoin if you want. But some people want to, understand it. So they come to a meetup. Say with my bar, you can pay with Bitcoin, but you don't have to. Say with the cafe, we're opening a cafe football club. Again, you don't have to.
Yeah.
And I've just launched this Bedford Development Fund called the Bedford Future Fund.
Wow.
So I've just deposited, I put 51,000 in there, £25,000 in Bitcoin, £26,000 in cash. And that is to give grants to young people. I've not probably followed the correct rule. I probably should register a charity, but whatever, it's my money I'm giving away. But I've taken essentially half in Bitcoin. And so if you apply for a grant, you can choose whether to have it in Bitcoin or fiat. And if you want it in Bitcoin, we'll get you a wallet, we'll set you up and explain it to you. We've then got the Winklevoss invest in the money. And then if you look at the strategic document for the football club, there's a central component with the slide, which is our treasury. So I'm rather than like saying you should do this, I'm just saying watch what I'm doing. Mm-hmm. And everything I'm doing is because of Bitcoin in the town. So hopefully, one thing, I was with David Bailey the other day, and one of the things I've been toying with is running for mayor. I've got this ongoing.
Of Bedford?
Yeah, so
great.
I've got this ongoing war.
That's going to tie you down, though. You're not going to be able to travel as much.
No, but that's probably a good thing. I've done 8 years of this traveling now. It's like I'm tired. But the current mayor is fucking useless, and I've got this temptation to run for mayor.
I mean, you're already the mayor of Bedford, aren't you? De facto.
De facto. In some ways, well, I'm trying to do what a mayor would do, is just do good things. But I would go in on a very simple policy: is that we will promote Bitcoin in this town. Mm-hmm. We will cut taxes as much as possible, cut many staff as possible. Just be very kind of as libertarian as I can be. I'll probably phone up Stefan Rivera and say, "What do I do here?" But one of the things I thought I could do is take out a huge loan. What's the biggest loan I can take out on the council? Buy Bitcoin and then time lock it for 10 years and then go, whatever, fuckers. You can't do anything about this for a decade. So if you're pissed off, right, you're going to have to wait for a decade. But in a decade, you could, Bitcoin does this thing. Maybe it's 100 million, finances the town to be very special, cleans up the high street, gets rid of the crackheads, puts them into treatment centers, closes down the place where they're all... There's a bath. There's like a public toilet right next to the Corn Exchange. We had a conference. I was parked up to load stuff in. I realized there's like crackheads going in and out. And so I realized that I found out that's the place where they deal and get high. So all those things could be cleaned up.
Wow.
So yeah, I'm tempted to try and do a little bit of that in the town, but I don't know how much of my time it will take up.
Yeah, it could take up a lot. Oh, we'll see. I mean, that's one thing that I think as I've gotten to where I am, how much time is finite, right? It's the one thing that's it's one of the many things that are really important in life that are finite, and so restructuring my own life so I'm spending as much time contributing to the success of Bitcoin, sometimes directly and sometimes indirectly through these other policy areas that we invest in at FreeOp. And those of your listeners who have heard me talk about this before, but just to review, everything we do at the Foundation for Research on Equal Opportunity has to meet two tests. Test number one is we have to be convinced that a particular policy idea that we work on meaningfully improves the lives of Americans whose incomes or wealth are below the U.S. median. So people who are on the bottom half of the ladder. And the second is that it should result in a net expansion of liberty. So if you meet those two tests, net expansion of liberty and net improvement in social mobility and opportunity, then we'll work on it. And a lot of that work ends up being around things like cost of living because, so many people talk about income inequality, but they don't talk about, okay, what if I make more money, but it gets all eaten up by inflation? Or I live in a place that has, where I can't afford the rent. And that matters a lot more. At the end of the day, you can make less money if your cost of living is a quarter of what it is in a high-cost city or a high-cost country. So that's a big part of our work. And I think, going back to what we were talking about before, if we are to succeed at making Bitcoin more widely used and most importantly for the political ecosystem to embrace Bitcoin, that's the argument we have to be able to make successfully. We have to be able to make the argument successfully that Bitcoin isn't just great for the OGs that have tens of thousands of coins, but also for ordinary people who are just getting started at stacking sats or doing $50 a month or $100 a month, that for them, Bitcoin is valuable, that the future of their kids is going to be better in a world in which inflation isn't running rampant because the monetary system is more anchored towards Bitcoin.
Is it becoming an easier story to tell now?
I think that in certain ways, yes. In certain ways, it's about the same. I'd say that there continue to be particularly the political system is dominated by old people, and old people in general who've lived their entire lives in a world in which the U.S. has been the dominant superpower and the U.S. dollar has reigned supreme. It's really hard for them to get their heads around the idea that there may be this new technology that will ultimately compete with the U.S. dollar. For young people, it's very different. And so what's happened is, today, the white paper came out in 2008, so we're recording this in 2024. That's 16 years.
I know.
And that's a long time, actually. And think about it this way. The average, if you're 35 years old today, Bitcoin has been around for your entire adult life.
Yeah.
Right? And as time goes on, that becomes even more true. So the median age in the US is about, I think 45 years. So imagine 10 years from now, we're at a point where basically half of America has lived their entire adult lives in a world in which Bitcoin has existed. And those old fogies who think Bitcoin is a fraud, they've lived their entire lives in the kind of Pax Americana world. They start to fade off the scene and the younger people start to come in for whom not only is Bitcoin normal, it's kind of boring. The way, there was a time when it was really cool to be on Facebook, and now Facebook is a thing that your grandparents use to share pictures and keep an eye on you, right? And the kids are like, oh, I don't want to put that on Facebook because my parents will see it, right? Bitcoin will become that boring thing. That's what we should look forward to, is when Bitcoin becomes boring because it's been around and it's been validated, that's what we'll start to see. So I think as Bitcoin, particularly that 2017 cycle when Bitcoin really rose from the dead, so to speak. A lot of investors had written it off after the previous bear market, and then it sort of came back. And then it's happened again these last couple of years. For investors, for the financial community, I think that was the real sea change, because they saw that, okay, Bitcoin is not a fad. It's not going away. It's come back from the dead multiple times. It keeps going back up. And while I may not agree with Bitcoin or believe in it, it's clearly not going anywhere. It's here to stay. I think for the financial community, that sale has been made. I think for politicians, what we talked about at the beginning, that's starting to change, where I think you're looking at particularly Donald Trump, but not just Donald Trump, a lot of other people are seeing that the Bitcoin community is an energized and organized social movement. It's not merely a special interest. It's a bunch of people who care a lot about the success of Bitcoin. I think one of the things that I'm struck with the Bitcoin ecosystem is how unselfish it can be, right? Like, it's not just people saying, hey, let me keep my stuff. That's part of it, but it's also so many people in the Bitcoin community, like yourself, take what they've gained from Bitcoin and try to share it with as many people as possible, try to be helpful to as many people as possible. That's the signs of something that's more than merely economic self-interest. It's a real social movement. And as more politicians, particularly those who run for re-election a lot, they are highly skilled at recognizing motivated constituencies, the ones who will show up at the ballot box, who will reward policies that benefit them or that are in there that are aligned with them with their votes. They are very good at smelling that out. Like those pigs that sniff the truffles in France. That's how politicians are about energized constituencies. And so in this case, I think Bitcoin is becoming that kind of constituency. And the larger that constituency is, and the more motivated it is, and the more organized it is, then the politicians will we will close the sale with the politicians, where they'll say, you know what? Whether I'm for Bitcoin or not, where I read Austrian economics or not, it's not worth me fighting them. And that's going to be pretty significant. And then and we're winning that battle, but then the next one is, can we win the battles of the future when it's understood that Bitcoin is competitive with the dollar, and there are going to be people who are motivated to suppress that competition between the dollar and the Bitcoin. And we need to make sure that enough people understand that the U.S. and the dollar can benefit from being connected to Bitcoin than the other way around.
Wow.
So we got a lot of work ahead of us. We're winning in the short term, but we have a lot of wood to chop to get to where we want to be at the end.
Is there anything we've not covered that you also wanted to cover or have not asked you about?
I mean, you and I could go on for a long time about all sorts of things. I mean, there's lots of stuff to check out at freeop.org, our website. But I think the one thing I would just
subscribe, by the way, I often unsubscribe to emails. I never unsubscribe from the free op. It's not too regular. Yeah, but it's not too regular. And it's usually high value content. So
we try not to spam people. Yeah. We try to send stuff when we've got something to say. It's about once a month now is our newsletter. It's a substack.freeop.org, FREOPP1E.org. The one thing I would mention aside from that, other than, people can obviously follow me on Twitter and all that other stuff, and my writing at Forbes, is this film project. So if there are people out there who are interested in seeing this film come to fruition, please reach out to me on Twitter or find, you can email us at info@freeop.org because we're looking for Bitcoiners to help support this film and get it out. And we're really excited about it. We have what's called a sizzle reel, which is...
I know a sizzle.
Yeah, you know all about this stuff. It's like the trailer for the movie that hasn't been made yet. And so we've produced the sizzle reel. So we're sending that around and looking forward to getting that out the door. It's a pretty exciting project. There's a documentary that just came out, actually, just a couple of weeks ago as we're recording this, by Stephanie Kelton, the modern monetary theorist, called Finding the Money. And it's all about how, basically we can, the Fed can print as much money as it wants, and that's great. And we should use that to solve all the social problems that we think there are in the world. And the only thing we have to worry about is inflation, but we don't really have to worry about that because there's not going to be any inflation if we do the things that we want to do. It's amazing in its lack of self-awareness, let's say. So you can think of this movie as kind of the mirror image of that in terms of really highlighting for people the costs.
Dude, I had
of the policies we've had.
I had her on the podcast.
You had her on the podcast? Oh my gosh, I have to find that. I have not seen that.
Yeah, it's an old one. I have on my own, but I think she's nuts. I think she's found a grift. It's her thing to but it just doesn't make sense. Her whole position is factually untrue. It's provably untrue. So she's just lying. Either she's ignorant or she's a liar. So I said to
I always try to give people the benefit of the doubt just so I can try to understand their arguments better. And I think the one thing that is a real head scratcher with Stephanie Kelton and all the modern monetary theorists is, so she makes this argument. It's the core of this documentary and a lot of her writing, is that the federal debt and the federal deficit, we should stop using those terms. They're actually surpluses because all the money that we are spending that we don't have is actually being put in people's pockets. And therefore it's good. It's good that we have a $33 trillion debt because that means that's $33 trillion that's being spent into society. And there's a really important asterisk to that point that she just completely seems to be either unaware of or ignores, which is that $34 trillion of debt, that multi-trillions of deficits that we're piling up every year in the United States, that's not being spread out equally to every American. That's being sent to financial institutions. When the Federal Reserve prints money, it doesn't go to you or me. It goes to JP Morgan. It goes to Goldman Sachs. It goes to Morgan Stanley. They then take that money and then invest it in the stock market or in real estate or in bonds, like the Treasury bond, which is one of the reasons why the Fed does it. And then eventually that money that starts out in the financial sector trickles down and eventually finds its way into high housing prices and inflation and these other things. And the last person to get the money is that ordinary person on the street. So if Stephanie Kelton's argument is that, yes, deficits are wonderful because ordinary people are going to benefit, the exact opposite is true. We have more wealth inequality today than we had 50 years ago when Nixon took us off the gold standard, precisely because that money doesn't go to ordinary people. It goes to the wealthy and to elite institutions.
Well, I remember specifically one of your articles, it's lived with me for a long time, where you said even low inflation has a compounding effect on the poor and a marginally different effect on the poorest in society.
Right.
And so that's always stuck with me. And so even when she talks about, like, as long as we can keep control of inflation, like, what does control of inflation mean?
Right.
You're still ripping off the poorest in society.
2% inflation year after year after year means that in one generation, you've lost half of the value of the US dollar.
Shut up, Stephanie Kelton. Fuck off.
Well, all that to say that she's doing her part to advance her views, and it's up to us to explain why they're deeply misguided. And so that's why we're really excited about this film project.
How much are you raising? Do you need for?
We need to raise $1.35 million. So it's $1.5 million overall, and FreeOp is fronted the first 10% of that, and then we're going to raise the rest.
So you're going proper full feature.
It's a proper feature-length documentary, like 90 minutes or so, and we've already interviewed a bunch of really cool people for it. We were down, so I got invited to attend Malay's inauguration. So I said, hey, can I bring my film crew? So we shot a lot of man on the street videos down there for that, which was really cool. And we're going to be shooting. We're hoping to shoot in Turkey and Japan as well, so we can show, okay, not only let's explain here's what's going on in the U.S., but here are some of the examples of other countries which either have high inflation, like Turkey and Japan, Turkey and Argentina, or Japan. Because one of the arguments you hear people make on the other side of this is, hey, deficits and debt are no big deal. Printing money is no big deal. Look at Japan. I mean, they're not having Weimar Germany like hyperinflation. They're fine. And they're not fine. I mean, Japan is a stagnant, aging economy where ordinary people don't have a great economic future. Nope. Yes, it's not Weimar Germany. That's absolutely true. But if your argument for the status quo is that the best case future for the United States is that we become like Japan, and the worst case scenario is we become more like Turkey or Argentina, that's not a great range of outcomes for the future of America, for our kids and grandkids.
Nope.
We should want something better.
Oh, man. How's Milei getting on, by the way? Like, it was noisy during the election, but I haven't really seen much recently.
Well, it's very interesting. When I was down there, my number one goal, other than the filming stuff, was I really want to dig into how the Argentine system works and what ability he has to change things, because their constitution in Argentina is modeled roughly after the U.S. There's a presidency, there's a court system, and there's a legislature, and they're all theoretically independent of each other. But over the years, as the Peronists modified the Argentine constitution, the presidency got more and more power. So I wanted to see, because his party doesn't have many seats in the Congress of Argentina. So I'm like, how is he going to get his reforms through? And in fact, he's struggled to get a lot of his fiscal reforms through the Congress. But there are certain, as I learned when I was down there, there are certain techniques that he has that a U.S. president doesn't have. So for example, in the U.S., if the Congress authorizes spending on, say, building a lot of highways, under this law from 1974 called the Impoundment Act, the president is required to spend the money. He can't not spend the money. He has to adhere to the law that Congress passed. Now, in Argentina, that's not true. So in Argentina, if Congress says, hey, we want to spend this slush fund on overpaying for this contract to build a road or a school, Milei can just be like, I'm not going to spend the money. So one thing he did was he said, I'm canceling all contracts that haven't officially gotten underway yet. So we're going to save money that way. Another thing that's interesting in Argentina is if the Congress fails to pass a budget for the following year, then the previous year's budget automatically gets re-upped. So, if they spent 100 billion pesos last year, and I'm just making this number up, and they didn't pass a budget, then you're going to spend 100 billion pesos the next year. Now, the problem is, if the peso's value has been cut in half, by simply re-upping last year's budget, you've actually slashed the budget in real terms by 50%. Right. So these are some of the subtle procedural tools that Milei has that the US president does not have, that he's used to start to get the problem under control. And so inflation has fallen in Argentina. They recorded a budget surplus for the first time in decades through some of these procedural subtleties. So this isn't to say that he's fixed everything and that he's achieved all of his goals, but the amount of reform that he has achieved compared to what, say, the typical person probably expected, outsider person expected in when he was inaugurated last year, it's pretty impressive. And I think there's reason to be optimistic. And he did a really great job in his inauguration speech of saying, look, it's going to take a couple years for our reforms to take effect. So things are going to get worse before they get better. He really conditioned people to not have high expectations right away. And the voters who supported him, they've lived through this, right? They're realistic. They understand that the old ways weren't getting it done and that you need to try something different. So they're giving him the runway. And so the real question is going to be, if fast forward to say 2027 or so, are things going to look better? And if they are, and he gets reelected, then you could imagine he does get more votes in Congress, much like we've seen in El Salvador, where the party of Bukele has now dominant control over the parliament there, or the Congress there. So one could imagine that's true of Milei in the future. But today, he's still accomplished quite a bit.
That's
so
impressive.
It's encouraging.
Amazing. All right, well, listen, always good to see you. We will pimp it all out in the show notes. If you send us a link for the fundraiser for the video, keep doing your thing. Every time I come to Austin, I love chatting to you. It's always learn a lot.
Always great to see you in Austin.
All right. Well, thank you. And thank you everyone for listening. See you soon.